Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, delighted to have you here for another quiet tale of reason and observation. Tell me, has the evening found you settled? Perhaps near lamplight, a cup growing cool, the day's noise finally fading. These are the hours when Dr. Watson took up his pen, recording truths others failed to see. If you enjoy these moments of calm inquiry, do subscribe. Now, make yourself comfortable. For as Holmes knew well, the impossible is merely the improbable awaiting explanation. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well. Link just below. Chapter 1. The Snowbound Arrival. It was in the bitter winter of 1892 that my friend Sherlock Holmes received a most singular communication from a Mr. Alistair Pembroke, a barrister of considerable standing in Lincoln's Inn. The letter, which arrived one grey December morning whilst Holmes sat absorbed in the chemical analysis of certain stains upon a waistcoat, was brief, yet possessed of an urgency that even the most casual reader could not mistake. Pembroke wrote of a matter requiring Holmes's immediate attendance at his country residence, Blackthorn Grange, situated some miles beyond the village of Ashthorpe in Oxfordshire. The nature of the case he would not commit to paper, save to say that it concerned a question of document security, and that discretion was paramount. What elevated this request above the commonplace was his postscript, that Holmes should prepare for an absence of several days, as the weather reports promised heavy snow and the Grange, once reached, was not easily departed. Holmes read the letter twice, his keen grey eyes narrowing in that manner I had come to recognise as indicative of genuine interest. "What do you make of it, Watson?" he inquired, passing me the single sheet. I examined the communication carefully. The paper was of excellent quality, the handwriting firm and regular, suggesting a man of methodical habits and considerable education. "A barrister with something to hide," I ventured, "or perhaps to protect." "Precisely," Holmes replied, rising from his chair with that sudden energy that marked his transitions from languor to action. "And the insistence upon winter travel suggests either genuine urgency or a desire for isolation. We depart this afternoon. Mrs. Hudson shall require notice, and you, my dear fellow, should pack warmly." The journey to Blackthorn Grange proved as arduous as Pembroke had intimated. We departed Paddington Station beneath leaden skies, and by the time our train reached Oxford, the first flakes were beginning to fall. A hired carriage conveyed us the remaining distance through lanes that grew progressively narrower and more difficult to navigate. The snow fell with increasing persistence, transforming the landscape into a monotonous expanse of white, punctuated only by the skeletal forms of winter trees. It was well past nightfall when we finally glimpsed the lights of Blackthorn Grange through the swirling snow. The house itself stood isolated upon a modest elevation, a substantial Georgian structure of grey stone that appeared both dignified and vaguely forbidding in the storm's embrace. Our driver, a taciturn local man, deposited us at the entrance with evident relief, and departed with such haste that I suspected he feared being trapped by the worsening conditions. We were admitted by an elderly manservant whose manner suggested long and faithful service. He relieved us of our snow-laden coats and led us through a spacious entrance hall to a drawing-room where a fire blazed welcomingly. There we found our host awaiting us. Mr. Alistair Pembroke rose as we entered, and I formed an immediate impression of a man who carried authority with natural ease. He was perhaps 50 years of age, tall and spare, with iron grey hair and features that suggested both intelligence and a certain habitual reserve. His greeting was courteous, yet brief, and I detected in his manner that particular tension that comes to men who have lived too long with an unresolved difficulty. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am grateful you have come despite the inclement weather," he said, extending his hand. "I fear the conditions may worsen before they improve, but your presence brings me considerable relief." Holmes acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Your letter suggested a matter requiring both discretion and isolation, Mr. Pembroke. It would appear you have secured both." "Indeed," Pembroke replied, gesturing for us to be seated. "I have invited a small number of guests for the holidays, though the word guests perhaps misrepresents the situation. Each person present has a connection, however tangential, to the matter at hand. I felt it best to gather them here before presenting you with the full circumstances." "How many comprise your household at present?" Holmes inquired. "Including yourselves, we are 8 in total. There is Sir Montague Ashford, a retired High Court judge whom I have known for many years. Mr. Edward Finchley, a young solicitor from my own firm. My sister, Mrs. Caroline Verner, who's been widowed these past 3 years and resides with me. And finally, Mr. Thomas Wickham, my clerk, who manages much of my professional correspondence and documentation." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "And the servants?" "The manservant who admitted you, Graves, and Mrs. Hodges, the housekeeper and cook. Both have been in my employ for over a decade and are entirely trustworthy. They maintain quarters separate from the main house." "I see," Holmes murmured. "And the matter itself?" Pembroke rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow that now fell in thick curtains, obscuring all view of the surrounding countryside. "Tomorrow, Mr. Holmes, I shall show you the object that has brought you here. For tonight I ask only that you observe my guests at dinner and form your own impressions. I have told them merely that you are a consulting detective visiting as a precautionary measure regarding certain valuable papers. They know nothing of the specific nature of my concern." Holmes regarded our host with an expression I could not entirely read. "You're asking me to work in partial darkness, Mr. Pembroke." "Until morning only," the barrister replied. "I have my reasons for this approach, which I believe you will understand once you know the full particulars. For now, I can tell you only this. Within my private study there rests a document of considerable consequence, sealed and secured in a manner I believe to be inviolable. Yet I have come to suspect that belief may be dangerously mistaken." Before Holmes could respond, a bell sounded distantly and Pembroke straightened. "That will be the dinner gong. Shall we join the others?" We followed our host into a handsome dining room where the remaining members of the household had already assembled. The introductions were performed with proper formality, and I studied each individual as opportunity allowed. Sir Montague Ashford possessed that particular blend of dignity and weariness that comes to men who have long administered justice. Mr. Finchley was perhaps 30, earnest and somewhat nervous in manner, with the pale complexion of one who labours long indoors. Mrs. Verner proved to be a woman of middle years, handsome in a severe fashion, who spoke little but observed much. Mr. Wickham, the clerk, was a quiet, unremarkable man, whose self-effacing manner suggested a lifetime spent in subordinate positions. The dinner proceeded with civility, the conversation touching upon neutral topics with the careful courtesy of strangers uncertain of their common ground. Yet beneath the surface politeness, I detected an atmosphere of constraint, a watchfulness that suggested each person present harboured private concerns they dared not voice. Holmes contributed little to the conversation, instead directing his attention to observation. I saw his gaze move from face to face, noting gestures, reactions, and the small revelations of character that most men overlook. As the meal concluded and we retired once more to the drawing-room, I moved to the window and observed that the snow had deepened considerably. The carriage that had delivered us was now barely visible beneath its white burden, and no trace remained of the track by which we had arrived. We were, I realised, quite thoroughly sealed within Blackthorn Grange, as isolated as if we occupied an island in mid-ocean. Whatever drama Pembroke anticipated would play itself out without possibility of outside interference or escape. I turned to find Holmes watching me, and in his eyes I read the same recognition. The trap, if such it was, had closed behind us. The game, as he was fond of saying, was afoot. Chapter 2. A file no one must open. I slept poorly that first night at Blackthorn Grange, troubled by dreams I could not quite recall upon waking. When I descended to breakfast the following morning, I found the world transformed, The snow had ceased during the night, leaving behind a profound stillness broken only by the occasional creak of settling timbers. Through the dining room windows I observed drifts that reached halfway up the garden walls, sculpted by wind into shapes both beautiful and forbidding. Holmes was already seated at the table, engaged in desultory conversation with Sir Montague Ashford concerning certain recent judicial reforms. The judge's responses were measured and precise, yet I noticed he consumed his breakfast with mechanical efficiency, as though his mind dwelt elsewhere. Of our host there was no sign, nor of the other guests. Mr. Pembroke breakfasts in his study, Mrs. Hodges informed me as she brought fresh coffee. He requests that you and Mr. Holmes join him there at your convenience. Holmes drained his cup and rose immediately. Then we shall not keep him waiting, Watson. If you will excuse us, Sir Montague. The judge inclined his head, but I thought I detected a flicker of something, concern perhaps, or calculation, in his expression before he returned his attention to his newspaper. Pembroke's study occupied the eastern corner of the house, a substantial room lined with legal volumes and lit by 2 tall windows that now framed nothing but white emptiness. Our host stood beside his desk, and I observed that he had forgone breakfast entirely, his face bearing the greyish pallor of a man who has passed the night without sleep. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "I must now acquaint you with the matter that has brought you here." He moved to a heavy oak cabinet that stood against the far wall and produced a key from his waistcoat pocket. The cabinet door swung open to reveal several shelves, upon which rested various legal dispatch boxes of the sort commonly employed by barristers for transporting sensitive documents. Pembroke withdrew one such box, distinguished from its fellows by its unusual weight and the elaborate lock mechanism securing its hasp. "This box," he said, placing it upon his desk, "contains a single file. That file holds testimony gathered during my investigation of a financial matter some 7 years past. The investigation was never completed for reasons I need not detail. The testimony itself implicates a gentleman of considerable prominence in activities that would, if proven, result in both criminal prosecution and utter social ruin." Holmes had drawn near, examining the box with evident interest. It was constructed of heavy iron, lined with what appeared to be steel plate, and fitted with a lock of German manufacture. "Why was the investigation abandoned?" Holmes inquired. Pembroke's jaw tightened. Political considerations. The gentleman in question possessed powerful allies who made it clear that pursuing the matter would be inadvisable. I was a younger man then, less certain of my convictions. I yielded to pressure and agreed to seal the file indefinitely. "Yet you retained it." "I did. Call it insurance, or perhaps simple cowardice dressed as prudence. The file was sealed with my personal signet in wax, locked within this box, and placed in my cabinet. I am the only person who possesses a key to either lock." Holmes circled the desk slowly, his gaze never leaving the dispatch box. "When did you last verify the contents?" "Not since the day I sealed it. Until recently I had no cause to question its security." "And what has changed?" Pembroke moved to the window, presenting us with his back. When he spoke again, his voice had fallen to barely more than a whisper. 3 weeks ago I received an anonymous communication, a single sheet of paper delivered by common post, bearing only these words: 'The file you believe sealed has been read.' No signature, no further elaboration. I dismissed it as either mischief or an attempt at extortion based upon rumour. "But you're no longer certain," Holmes observed. 2 days later, a second letter arrived. This one contained a specific detail from the testimony, a date, a location, information that could only have come from within the file itself. "Mr. Holmes, I tell you with absolute conviction that I have disclosed the contents to no living soul. Yet someone knows." Holmes had produced his lens and was examining the lock mechanism with minute attention. "Has anyone else entered this study during your absence?" "It is kept locked when I am not present. Graves possesses the only other key, and I would stake my reputation upon his loyalty." "The windows?" "As you observe, we are on the ground floor, but the windows are fitted with interior bars as a precaution. Nothing larger than a cat could pass through them. I watched as Holmes completed his circuit of the room, pausing occasionally to examine some detail invisible to my own eyes. He tested the window bars with a firm hand, inspected the fireplace flue, and finally returned his attention to the dispatch box itself. "Mr. Pembroke," he said at length, "I must examine the file." Our host hesitated, then produced a second key and unlocked the box. The interior was lined with green baize, and resting within was a thick folder bound with ribbon and sealed with multiple layers of dark red wax impressed with Pembroke's signet ring. Holmes lifted it with careful hands, turning it this way and that in the morning light. For several minutes he said nothing, his examination so concentrated that he seemed to have forgotten our presence entirely. Finally he looked up. "The seals appear intact. No signs of tampering are immediately evident. Yet I observe several curious features that warrant further investigation." He paused, his expression grave. "Tell me, who among your current guests was aware of this file's existence prior to your receiving these anonymous letters?" Pembroke considered the question carefully. Sir Montague was the presiding judge in a related civil matter. He knew I had gathered certain evidence, though not its ultimate disposition. My clerk Wickham assisted with the original investigation and knows the file exists, though he never saw its contents. As for the others, he trailed off uncertainly. "Mrs. Verner. My sister knows I possess sensitive materials from my practice. Nothing more specific. And the young solicitor. Finchley? He joined my firm only last year. I cannot imagine how he would have learned of it unless—" Pembroke's eyes widened slightly. "Good Lord, unless someone told him." Holmes returned the file to its box with the same meticulous care he had employed in removing it. "I shall require this to remain precisely as it is for the present. Touch nothing, admit no one to this study without my knowledge, and speak of this matter to no one beyond these walls. Watson and I shall conduct our investigation with discretion." "You believe the file has been compromised?" "I believe, Mr. Pembroke, that someone wishes you to believe it has been compromised. Whether that belief corresponds to reality remains to be determined. The distinction, I assure you, is significant. As we departed the study, I ventured to ask Holmes his initial thoughts on the matter. "Patience, Watson," he replied. "We have before us a problem of unusual delicacy. A file allegedly inviolate yet demonstrably red. A house isolated by snow containing precisely those individuals who might possess motive to access it. And most intriguing of all, a host who invites us to investigate yet seems peculiarly reluctant to reveal the full extent of his suspicions. You doubt Pembroke's candour? I doubt everyone's candour in a case such as this. Truth, my dear fellow, is rarely volunteered. It must be extracted piece by careful piece from the matrix of evasion and self-interest in which it lies embedded." We had reached the drawing-room, where I observed Mr. Finchley and Mrs. Verner engaged in quiet conversation before the fire. They fell silent as we entered, Myoki, their faces assuming expressions of polite inquiry that struck me as slightly too studied to be entirely natural. Through the window, the snow-covered landscape stretched away beneath a colourless sky. We were trapped here, I reflected, in this house with its locked files and guarded secrets, until such time as the weather chose to release us. And somewhere among these superficially respectable individuals, someone harboured knowledge they should not possess. Holmes had positioned himself near the mantelpiece, apparently absorbed in examining a Chinese vase that rested there, but I knew him too well to be deceived. His apparent idleness masked intense observation, and I understood that the investigation had begun in earnest. The game was not merely afoot, it had entered a phase where every word, every gesture, like every unguarded glance might prove decisive. Chapter 3. The Impossible Breach. The remainder of that day passed with deceptive tranquillity. Holmes occupied himself with what appeared to be casual wanderings about the house, pausing to admire architectural details or engage in brief exchanges with whichever guest happened to cross his path. To the uninitiated observer, he might have seemed merely a restless visitor enduring enforced idleness. I knew better. Each seemingly aimless perambulation served purpose. Each idle remark concealed a pointed inquiry. Luncheon brought the household together once more, and I noted the various dynamics at play. Sir Montague maintained his judicial reserve, speaking primarily when addressed directly. Young Finchley appeared anxious to please, offering observations on legal matters with an eagerness that suggested insecurity rather than confidence. Mrs. Verner presided over the meal with quiet efficiency, her attention frequently drawn to the windows and the unchanging vista of snow beyond. As for Wickham, the clerk remained so thoroughly self-effacing that one might almost forget his presence entirely. Pembroke himself seemed aged since our morning interview, the burden of his secret knowledge weighing visibly upon him. He ate little and excused himself immediately after the meal concluded, citing correspondence that required his attention. The afternoon dragged on with that peculiar heaviness that afflicts time when one is confined against one's will. I attempted to occupy myself with a volume from Pembroke's library, but found my attention wandering. Holmes had vanished upstairs, and I was left to my own devices in the drawing-room, where Mrs. Verner sat engaged in needlework while Finchley wrote letters at the writing desk. It was perhaps 4 o'clock when Graves appeared in the doorway, his normally impassive features betraying distinct agitation. "Dr. Watson, sir," he said quietly, "Mr. Pembroke requests your immediate presence in his study, and if you would be so good as to fetch Mr. Holmes." The urgency in his tone brought me to my feet at once. I located Holmes in his chamber, where he sat surrounded by what appeared to be a collection of household candles in various states of consumption, examining them with his lens. "Pembroke summons us," I announced. "Graves seems quite disturbed." Holmes rose without comment, abandoning his curious examination. We descended together and found our host standing in the doorway of his study, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I must ask you to observe something most peculiar." He ushered us inside and closed the door firmly. The room appeared undisturbed, precisely as we had left it that morning. The dispatch box sat upon the desk where Holmes had replaced it, seemingly untouched. "I returned here not 20 minutes past," Pembroke began, "to retrieve a reference work from my shelves. As I passed the desk I noticed, or rather, I thought I noticed, that the box had been moved slightly. A matter of inches, perhaps. But I am a man of habit, Mr. Holmes, and I know precisely where I left it." Holmes approached the desk with measured steps. "You opened it?" I felt compelled to verify the file's condition. The lock opened without difficulty, and the file appeared exactly as before. Yet when I lifted it... He paused, struggling with some powerful emotion. "Mr. Holmes, I am certain, as certain as I have ever been of anything, that the seals have been disturbed." I moved closer to examine the file for myself. To my untrained eye, the wax seals appeared perfectly intact, the impression of Pembroke's signet ring clear and unbroken. Holmes produced his lens once more and subjected the seals to prolonged scrutiny. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he worked, turning the file with delicate precision, angling it to catch the light from different directions. "Mr. Pembroke," he said at last, "you stated that you sealed this file 7 years ago. Under what conditions?" "In this very room, at this desk. It was evening in summer. I used my signet ring and my usual stick of sealing wax." "The same wax you employ for correspondence?" "Yes. I purchased it from a stationer in Chancery Lane. I have used no other for the past decade." Holmes set down his lens and straightened. "Then I must inform you that you are correct. These seals have indeed been disturbed." Pembroke swayed slightly, and I moved to steady him. "But they appear unbroken," I protested. "How can you be certain?" "Observe, Watson." Holmes indicated a portion of the seal with his finger, though I confess I saw nothing remarkable. "The wax here shows a faint line of demarcation, visible only under magnification and proper light. More significantly, the temperature differential between the surface and the deeper layers suggests that heat has been applied within the past 24 hours. Someone has softened these seals, lifted them, and reaffixed them with considerable skill." But to what purpose? Pembroke demanded. If the seals were replaced, surely the file itself— He broke off, seized the folder, and with trembling fingers broke the seal entirely. The ribbon came away, and he spread the contents across his desk. For a moment he simply stared, his breathing audible in the quiet room. Then he looked up at Holmes with an expression of utter bewilderment. "The documents appear authentic," he whispered. "The testimony is here, apparently complete. Yet something—" He shuffled through the pages more frantically. "The order, the sequence is wrong. These depositions were arranged chronologically. I'm absolutely certain of it. Now they are rearranged." Holmes bent over the papers, his eyes moving rapidly across the text. "How many pages comprise the complete file?" 43, all bearing my notation and signature on the reverse. "And all are present?" Pembroke counted carefully, then counted again. "Yes, all 43. But Mr. Holmes, if someone went to such elaborate lengths to access this file, why merely rearrange the contents? What possible advantage could that serve?" "An excellent question," Holmes murmured. He had moved to the window and was examining the bars with renewed attention. "And one that suggests our adversary's objective may be more subtle than simple theft or destruction. Tell me, has anyone entered this room since our morning interview?" "No one. The door has remained locked, and I carry the only key upon my person. I have been in the drawing room or the dining room throughout the day, visible to the other guests. And the window bars? Examined by Graves this morning at my request. All secure, as you can verify for yourself." Holmes tested each bar methodically, then turned his attention to the lock on the door. He spent several minutes in examination, occasionally emitting small sounds of interest or satisfaction. Finally, he straightened and faced our thoroughly unsettled host. "Mr. Pembroke, I must ask you to consider carefully before answering my next question. Is there any portion of the testimony contained in these documents that someone might wish to verify without removing the file entirely? Some specific detail, perhaps, or a particular phrase whose exact wording would be significant?" Pembroke had sunk into his desk chair, the pages of testimony scattered before him. He appeared to age before my eyes as he contemplated Holmes's inquiry. "There is," he admitted at last, "a date, the precise date upon which a certain transaction occurred. If that date were known with certainty, it could be used to corroborate or refute other evidence. But how could anyone have suspected?" He fell silent, his gaze moving to the locked door, then to the barred windows, and finally to the dispatch box that had proven so inadequate a guardian of its secrets. "This is impossible," he said quietly. "No one could have entered. The house is sealed by snow, no tracks approach or depart. The study is locked and barred, yet the evidence is undeniable. Someone has been here, Mr. Near Holmes. Someone has read what no one should have read." Holmes had returned to his examination of the file, paying particular attention now to certain pages. "Nothing is impossible, Mr. Pembroke, merely improbable. And it has been my experience that the improbable, once properly understood, reveals itself to be entirely logical." He gathered the scattered pages and restored them to their folder with care. "I must ask that you speak of this development to no one. Allow the household to believe the file remains inviolate. Meanwhile, Watson and I shall pursue certain inquiries." As we left Pembroke to his troubled contemplation, I ventured to ask Holmes what he had observed. "Everything and nothing, Watson. The lock shows signs of having been engaged, yet the key has not turned in the conventional manner. The seals were lifted with considerable expertise, suggesting someone familiar with legal documents and their authentication. And most curious of all, the effort expended to access the file vastly exceeds the apparent result achieved. Then what was the true objective?" Holmes paused at the top of the stairs, his expression troubled. "That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must determine. For I begin to suspect that we are witnesses not to a simple theft of information, but to something far more complex. Someone in this house is playing a game whose rules we do not yet comprehend." Below us, I heard the murmur of voices from the drawing room. Dinner would be served shortly, and we would sit once more with individuals whose courtesy masked calculation. One of them, I reflected grimly, was a very clever person indeed. Chapter 4. Holmes and the Physical Paradox. Dinner that evening proved a strained affair. Pembroke made a valiant effort to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but his distraction was evident to anyone who cared to observe. Sir Montague commented upon the excellence of Mrs. Hodges's roast beef, with the sort of determined geniality that men employ when wishing to avoid more pressing topics. Young Finchley contributed little beyond monosyllables, and I noticed that his gaze frequently strayed toward our host with an expression I could not quite interpret. Holmes, for his part, maintained an attitude of detached amusement, as though he found the entire gathering a source of mild entertainment. Yet I observed that he consumed remarkably little, and his attention never wavered from the other diners. It was a performance I had witnessed before, this facade of indifference concealing acute concentration. Mrs. Verner proved the most composed of the company. She directed the service with quiet authority, and even ventured several observations on the likelihood of the snow's continuation, citing certain signs she claimed to have learned from the local farmers. Her self-possession struck me as remarkable, given the tension that pervaded the room. Wickham, seated at the foot of the table in his capacity as clerk, maintained his usual unobtrusive presence. He ate methodically, spoke only when addressed, and seemed content to occupy that social middle ground between servant and guest that his position entailed. Following dinner, Holmes excused himself with the explanation that he required an early retirement. I knew this to be subterfuge, and was therefore unsurprised when, upon reaching our chambers, he immediately donned his dressing gown and announced his intention to conduct a thorough examination of Pembroke's study. I observed Pembroke slip Graves a note during the final course, he explained, no doubt instructing him to ensure the household retires early. We shall have perhaps 2 hours of undisturbed access. We descended via the servants' stair, which Holmes had evidently reconnoitred earlier in the day. The study door stood ajar, and we entered to find a pair of candles burning on the desk and the dispatch box once more in evidence. Holmes moved immediately to the windows, subjecting the bars to an examination even more minute than his earlier inspection. He produced a small vial of powder from his pocket, and dusted the metal surfaces lightly, studying the result with his lens. "No finger marks of recent vintage," he murmured. "The bars have not been moved or manipulated. And observe, Watson, the accumulation of dust along the lower edge of the frame. Quite undisturbed, save for the cleaning that occurred." He paused to examine more closely. Approximately 1 week past, judging by the consistency of the deposit. He turned his attention next to the door lock, which he dismantled with a small set of tools I recognized from previous investigations. The mechanism lay exposed upon the desk, its components gleaming in the candlelight. "Most illuminating," he said, more to himself than to me. "The cylinder shows definite signs of recent engagement. See here, Watson, it had these fresh scratches on the bolt housing, yet the tumblers themselves bear no such marks. The key has been inserted, certainly, but the lock was not turned in the conventional manner. Then how was it opened? That is indeed the question." He reassembled the mechanism with practised efficiency and restored it to its position. "Consider the facts as we know them. The room is secured by a lock showing signs of engagement without conventional operation. The windows are barred and undisturbed. No footprints approach the house through the snow, yet the file has been accessed with sufficient skill to lift and replace the seals." He crossed to the fireplace, which stood cold and empty. Kneeling upon the hearth, he examined the interior with his lens, occasionally reaching up into the flue to test its dimensions. "Nothing larger than a cat could navigate this passage," he concluded, "and the accumulation of soot is consistent with months of disuse. No disturbance here." The dispatch box itself came under renewed scrutiny. Holmes examined every surface, measured its dimensions with a small tape he produced from his waistcoat, and tested the lock with various delicate instruments. At length he sat back upon his heels, his expression thoughtful. "The box is precisely what it appears to be, A secure container designed to frustrate casual interference. Yet it possesses one interesting feature. Observe the slight gap between the lid and the body when the lock is engaged. No more than a hair's breadth, but sufficient perhaps for a very thin blade to be inserted. Surely not enough to extract documents. No. But possibly enough for other purposes. He opened the box and removed the file, studying once more the seals that Pembroke had broken. Tell me, Watson, what strikes you as most peculiar about this entire affair? I considered the question carefully. That someone should go to such elaborate lengths to access the file, yet apparently do nothing with the information save rearrange the pages. Precisely. The effort invested suggests serious purpose. The result achieved suggests either incompetence or misdirection. I am inclined to dismiss the former, which leaves us with a most intriguing possibility, that the rearrangement was not the true objective, or that the objective has not yet been accomplished. Consider this scenario. Someone gains access to the file, reads what they require, but realizes that evidence of their intrusion will inevitably be discovered. They therefore create a different mystery, that of the rearranged pages, to distract attention from their true purpose. He rose and moved to the desk upon which various writing implements and sealing materials lay arranged. The stick of sealing wax drew his particular attention. He held it close to the candle flame, watching as a bead of wax formed and dropped onto a scrap of paper. Interesting. This wax softens at a relatively low temperature and maintains plasticity for a considerable period before hardening. An individual with knowledge of such properties might exploit them to considerable advantage. You believe someone lifted the seals by warming them? I am certain of it. But the application of heat in a locked room presents its own difficulties. One cannot simply light a candle and conduct such delicate work without leaving some trace. Yet I have found no residue of candle wax save what one would expect from normal usage. No scorching upon the desk, no. He stopped abruptly, his gaze fixing upon a point near the window. Moving with sudden purpose, he knelt and examined the floorboards with minute attention. Watson, bring the candle here. I complied, and he indicated a small area where the wood appeared slightly discoloured. What do you observe? It appears darker than the surrounding boards. Water damage, perhaps? Not water. Notice the pattern, irregular, as though something was spilled and imperfectly cleaned. And the faint residue here suggests. He touched his finger to the spot and raised it to his nose. Oil. A few drops only, but sufficient to leave a trace. Oil? What possible connection? That remains to be determined, but I note its position, directly between the desk and the window, where someone standing might naturally allow a drop or two to fall from a lamp or lantern. He continued his examination, working outward from this discovery in a systematic pattern. Near the hearth, he paused again, this time to study a small deposit of ash that had escaped the fireplace and settled in a crack between the floorboards. Most curious, he murmured, collecting a sample in a paper he folded carefully and placed in his pocket. This ash is not from coal or wood, but from paper, a small quantity, easily overlooked, yet suggestive. The long case clock in the hallway chimed 11, and Holmes rose to his feet with evident reluctance. We must not press our advantage too far. Graves will be making his rounds shortly, and I would prefer our nocturnal investigation remain undiscovered. As we prepared to depart, I ventured to ask what conclusions he had drawn from his examination. Conclusions would be premature, he replied, but I have observed several facts of considerable interest. The room was entered despite being locked. The seals were lifted using controlled heat. Oil was spilled upon the floor. Paper was burned in small quantity. And somewhere in this constellation of facts lies the explanation for our impossibility. We regained our chambers without incident. As I prepared for bed, I found Holmes seated by the window, gazing out at the moonlit expanse of snow. "Do you know who is responsible?" I asked. "I have suspicions, Watson." but suspicion without proof is merely prejudice dressed in intellectual garb. We require evidence, and evidence of the sort that will satisfy not merely my own curiosity, but the rigorous standards of law. Then what is our next step? He turned from the window, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar intensity that marked the pursuit of a problem that had fully engaged his faculties. Tomorrow we shall conduct a different sort of investigation. We have examined the scene of the crime. Now we must examine the criminals, or rather, the potential criminals. For somewhere among this respectable gathering lurks an individual of uncommon ingenuity and considerable nerve. He smiled slightly, though the expression held no warmth. And I confess, Watson, I find myself rather looking forward to making their acquaintance. Chapter 5. The Silent Observations. The following morning brought no amelioration in the weather. If anything, the snow appeared to have settled more deeply during the night, and a bitter wind had arisen that drove crystalline particles against the window panes with a sound like scattered sand. We remained as thoroughly imprisoned as before, though I observed that the psychological weight of our confinement seemed to press more heavily upon the household with each passing hour. Holmes descended to breakfast with an air of cheerful energy that I recognised as entirely artificial. He engaged Sir Montague in conversation regarding a recent appeals court decision, displayed polite interest in Mrs. Verner's account of her late husband's military service, and even drew young Finchley into a discussion of conveyancing law that left the solicitor flushed with pleasure at having his opinion solicited by so distinguished a visitor. Only I, who knew him intimately, could detect the true nature of his attention. He was not conversing so much as conducting a series of subtle examinations, each exchange calculated to reveal something of the speaker's character, knowledge, or state of mind. Pembroke appeared haggard, his night having evidently been no more restful than my own. He ate mechanically and excused himself as soon as decency permitted, citing legal correspondence that demanded his attention. I noted that Wickham rose simultaneously and followed his employer from the room without comment, presumably to assist with the morning's business. "A most dedicated servant," Holmes observed once they had departed. "Mr. Wickham seems quite indispensable to Mr. Pembroke's professional affairs." "He has been in Pembroke's employ for nearly 15 years, Sir Montague offered, "a model of discretion and competence. There are few clerks of his calibre remaining in the profession." "Indeed? One might almost say he knows where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically speaking." The judge's expression stiffened almost imperceptibly. "I would not employ such a phrase, Mr. Holmes. Wickham is trustworthy precisely because he understands the sanctity of client confidentiality." Of course. I intended no slight." Holmes turned his attention to his coffee, but I saw the flicker of interest in his eyes. The morning progressed slowly. Holmes suggested a tour of the house, which Mrs. Verner graciously conducted. We examined the principal rooms, admired the collection of sporting prints in the library, and paid particular attention to the arrangement of the servants' quarters, which Holmes inspected with an interest that seemed excessive for mere architectural appreciation. "You manage the household admirably, Mrs. Verner," he remarked as we concluded our circuit. "It cannot be easy, maintaining such an establishment with only 2 servants." "Mrs. Hodges is remarkably capable," she replied, "and Graves has been with my brother since before his marriage. They understand the requirements of the house." "Your brother was married, then?" I had not realised. A shadow crossed her features. "His wife passed away some years ago. A fever, quite sudden. He does not speak of it." "Forgive my indelicacy." "And you came to live with him following your own bereavement?" "I did. My husband's death left me with limited means, and Alistair kindly offered me a home. I endeavoured to make myself useful in return." There was something in her tone, a bitterness carefully suppressed, that suggested the arrangement was perhaps less harmonious than her words indicated. Holmes appeared to note this as well, for he changed the subject with practised ease. "We discovered young Finchley in the library, ostensibly reading but clearly ill at ease. He started when we entered, and I observed him close his book with unnecessary haste." "Mr. Finchley," Holmes said warmly, I trust we are not disturbing your studies." "Not at all, Mr. Holmes. I was merely reviewing a treatise on property law. Rather dry stuff, I'm afraid." Holmes glanced at the volume's spine. "Blackstone's Commentaries. Hardly light reading for a holiday visit." The young man flushed. "I find myself with time on my hands, and I'm still establishing myself in the profession. Every opportunity for improvement must be seized." "Admirable dedication. Tell me, how long have you been associated with Mr. Pembroke's firm?" "Just over a year. I was most fortunate to secure the position. Mr. Pembroke is highly regarded in Lincoln's Inn." "And you are familiar with his more significant cases, I presume?" Finchley shifted uncomfortably. "I am granted access to current matters only. Historical cases remain under Mr. Pembroke's personal supervision naturally." "Naturally, though I imagine you must occasionally encounter references to past investigations in the course of your work." "Very rarely, Mr. Pembroke is quite particular about maintaining separate archives for concluded matters." Holmes appeared to accept this with a thoughtful nod, though I sensed he had extracted some information of value from the exchange. We left Finchley to his studies, and repaired to the drawing-room, where we found Sir Montague standing before the fire, lost in contemplation. The judge acknowledged our entrance with a slight inclination of his head, but did not immediately speak. Holmes settled into a chair and began filling his pipe with the methodical care that often preceded important observations. "Sir Montague," he began, "I wonder if I might impose upon your experience in a matter of some theoretical interest." "If I can be of assistance, Mr. Holmes." "In your years upon the bench, you must have encountered cases involving the authentication of documents. How does one typically establish that a sealed paper has not been tampered with?" The judge's expression became guarded. "The integrity of the seal is paramount, of course. Any break or distortion would be grounds for suspicion. But what of more sophisticated methods? Might a seal be lifted and replaced in such a manner as to escape casual detection?" Sir Montague turned to face Holmes directly, his judicial mask firmly in place. "Such techniques exist, certainly. I have seen cases where wax seals were softened through the application of heat and subsequently reaffixed. The resulting deception can be quite convincing. You have personal experience of such matters." "I have presided over trials where such evidence was presented. One develops a certain familiarity with the methods employed by those who would subvert the law." "Indeed. And in your observation, what sort of individual typically possesses both the knowledge and the nerve to attempt such a deception?" The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes, that someone in this household has engaged in document tampering?" "I am merely exploring possibilities, Sir Montague, purely theoretical possibilities." "Then I shall answer theoretically. Such an individual would require access to the documents in question, knowledge of legal procedures, and a motive sufficiently compelling to justify the considerable risk involved. Beyond that, I could not speculate." The tension in the room had become palpable. Holmes puffed thoughtfully upon his pipe, apparently oblivious to the judge's discomfort. "One final question, if I may. During your judicial career, did you ever encounter Mr. Pembroke in a professional capacity?" Sir Montague's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I noted it. "I may have done. One sees many barristers over the course of a career." "Of course. But I refer specifically to cases involving financial irregularities, matters of fraud, perhaps, or breach of fiduciary duty." "Mr. Holmes, I fail to see the relevance of these inquiries." "Merely satisfying my own curiosity, Sir Montague. A failing of mine, I confess." The judge excused himself shortly thereafter, citing a desire for solitude. Holmes watched him depart with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You baited him quite deliberately," I observed once we were alone. "I did. And his responses were most illuminating. Did you note how he avoided direct denial when I mentioned financial cases, and his insistence upon the theoretical nature of our discussion, even as he demonstrated detailed knowledge of seal tampering techniques? You suspect him?" "I suspect everyone, Watson. but I observe that Sir Montague displays the peculiar nervousness of a man who knows more than he wishes to reveal. Whether that knowledge pertains to the matter at hand remains to be determined. Through the window, I watched the wind sculpting fresh patterns in the snow. Another day was passing, and we remained no closer to identifying our culprit. Or so I believed. Holmes, however, appeared increasingly pleased with our progress. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, he announced his intention to spend some time in quiet contemplation. "The pieces are assembling themselves, Watson," he said. "Soon, very soon, the pattern will become clear." I could only hope his confidence was justified, for the atmosphere at Blackthorn Grange grew more oppressive with each passing hour. Chapter 6. Motives Beneath Stillness. That afternoon, whilst Holmes remained closeted in our chambers engaged in what he termed data synthesis, I found myself at loose ends. The drawing-room offered little appeal, and so I wandered toward the rear of the house, where a small conservatory overlooked what had once been, I surmised, a pleasant garden. Now it presented merely an undifferentiated expanse of white, broken only by the dark skeletal forms of dormant rose bushes. I had not been there long when Mrs. Verner entered, horsed to carrying a basket of sewing materials. She started slightly upon seeing me, then composed herself with admirable swiftness. "Dr. Watson, forgive me. I thought the room unoccupied. Please, do not let me disturb you. I was merely seeking a change of scenery." She settled into a chair near the window and began sorting through her threads with mechanical efficiency. For some minutes we maintained a companionable silence, broken only by the wind's persistent assault upon the glass panes. "You must find us a dull company," she said at length, not looking up from her work. "Trapped here with strangers and uncertain weather." "Not at all, though I confess the circumstances are somewhat unusual. My brother is troubled, more troubled than I have seen him in years." Now she did look at me, her expression frank. This matter he has engaged Mr. Holmes to investigate. It is serious, is it not?" I chose my words carefully. Mr. Pembroke has certain concerns regarding the security of his professional papers. I am not at liberty to discuss the particulars. "Of course." She returned her attention to her sewing. "Alistair has always been consumed by his work. Even when Eleanor was alive, the law took precedence over all else. Perhaps if he had been less devoted to his cases and more attentive to his wife." She trailed off, and I sensed she had revealed more than intended. "Mrs. Pembroke died quite young, I understand." "She was 32. A fever, the physician said, though I have often wondered if it was not something else. A broken heart, perhaps. Or simply the slow erosion of hope that comes from being perpetually neglected." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable now. Whatever her outward compliance with the household's rhythms, Mrs. Verner harboured deep resentments. "You were close to your sister-in-law?" We understood one another. Both of us married to men whose true passions lay elsewhere. At least my Henry had the excuse of military service. Alistair's devotion to justice. She laughed without humour. Or what he conceived as justice, which is not always the same thing. I was saved from formulating a response by the appearance of Wickham, who entered with his customary quietness and addressed Mrs. Verner with deferential courtesy. "Forgive the intrusion, madam, but Mr. Pembroke requests the household accounts for the past quarter. He mentioned you kept them in the conservatory writing desk." "Of course." She rose and moved to a small escritoire in the corner, from which she extracted a leather-bound ledger. As she handed it to the clerk, I observed a brief exchange of glances between them, nothing improper, but suggestive of a familiarity that transcended their respective positions. Wickham departed as silently as he had arrived, and Mrs. Verner resumed her seat with a slight flush upon her cheeks that might have been attributable to the room's warmth, though I suspected otherwise. I excused myself shortly thereafter and encountered young Finchley in the hallway, apparently en route to the library. He appeared even more agitated than during our morning interview, and his greeting was perfunctory. "Mr. Finchley," I ventured, "are you quite well? You seem distressed." He stopped, visibly wrestling with some internal conflict. When he spoke, his voice was low and urgent. "Dr. Watson, I wonder if I might speak with you in confidence. As a medical man, you are bound by certain professional discretions, are you not? Within reason, certainly. What troubles you?" He glanced about to ensure we were unobserved, then drew closer. "I fear I may have made a terrible mistake, a matter of judgment that could reflect poorly upon my professional reputation. Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Holmes." "No, that is to say, I'm not certain it is relevant to his investigation, and I should hate to appear improper." He struggled for words. "Dr. Watson, have you ever discovered that a colleague possessed information about you, information of a personal nature, and used it to secure your cooperation in matters you would otherwise have declined?" This was delicate ground indeed. "Are you suggesting you have been subject to some form of coercion?" "I am suggesting nothing, merely asking a hypothetical question." His face had gone pale. "If someone were to learn, for instance, that a young solicitor had made certain errors in judgment regarding client funds, errors subsequently corrected, but nonetheless potentially damaging to one's career, might that knowledge be employed to compel the solicitor's assistance in other matters?" "That would depend upon the nature of the assistance required." He seemed about to continue when footsteps sounded on the stair above. Finchley's expression transformed immediately to one of bland pleasantness, and he excused himself with excessive courtesy, leaving me to ponder what confidence he'd been on the verge of sharing. I found Holmes precisely where I had left him, surrounded by sheets of paper upon which he had sketched various diagrams and timelines. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bright with the peculiar excitement that seized him when a case approached its resolution. "Ah, Watson, your timing is impeccable. I've just completed a most interesting reconstruction. Come, tell me what you have learned during your perambulations." I recounted my conversations with Mrs. Verner and Finchley, noting their respective peculiarities and evasions. Holmes listened with focused attention, occasionally interjecting questions regarding specific details. "Excellent," he pronounced when I'd finished. "Your observations align perfectly with my own conclusions. We have here a most intricate web of relationships and motives, each strand pulling in its own direction, yet all connected to our central mystery." He rose and began to pace, a habit that invariably preceded significant pronouncements. "Consider what we have assembled. Sir Montague, who presided over cases connected to Pembroke's work and displays intimate knowledge of document tampering. Mrs. Verner, resentful of her brother and suspiciously familiar with the household clerk. Young Finchley, who hints at being compromised and compelled to act against his better judgment. And Wickham, the indispensable clerk who manages every aspect of Pembroke's professional life. But what connects them to the sealed file? Watson. That is where the matter becomes truly interesting. I spent the afternoon reviewing the few facts Pembroke revealed about the file's contents. The testimony concerns financial fraud involving a prominent figure. 7 years ago, the investigation was abandoned due to political pressure. Now consider the timing. He pulled out one of his diagrams, upon which he had marked various dates. 7 years past, Sir Montague was still an active judge, hearing cases in Chancery. Pembroke's investigation was conducted precisely during the period when several high-profile financial cases came before Sir Montague's court. Is it not possible that the judge encountered evidence related to Pembroke's secret file during the course of his official duties? You believe Sir Montague knows what the file contains? I believe he suspects, and suspicion, particularly for a man of his judicial temperament, would be intolerable. He would require certainty. But what of the others? Holmes smiled. Finchley speaks of being coerced, of errors regarding client funds. What if those errors involved the very fraud that Pembroke investigated? The young man would have been barely out of university 7 years ago, naive, malleable, perhaps employed by the firm under investigation. His presence in Pembroke's household might not be coincidental. And Mrs. Verner? Consider her history. Her husband died 3 years past, leaving her with limited means. Yet her marriage had been troubled, and she speaks of understanding with the late Mrs. Pembroke, who died mysteriously of a fever. What if Mrs. Verner's late husband was connected to the original fraud? What if her current circumstances resulted from financial ruin brought about by the same scandal Pembroke investigated? The implications were staggering. Then everyone here has some connection to the file. Not everyone, but enough to create an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and competing interests. Each person harbours their own reasons for wishing to know, or to suppress, the file's contents, and somewhere in this tangle of motives lies our answer. He returned to his chair and steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. But we are still missing something, Watson. The mechanism, the how, remains as elusive as ever, and until we understand the method, we cannot confidently identify the perpetrator. A knock at the door interrupted us. Graves stood in the hallway, his weathered face grave. "Mr. Holmes, mister. Pembroke requests your presence in his study. He says it is urgent." We descended immediately and found our host standing before his fireplace, staring down at something in his hand. He looked up as we entered, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I have just made a discovery that casts an entirely new light upon this affair." He extended his hand, revealing a small fragment of sealing wax, deep red in colour, and bearing the unmistakable impression of his signet ring. "I found this," he continued, "in the ashes of the fireplace. Someone has been practising with my seal." Chapter 7. The Convenient Discovery. Holmes took the fragment from Pembroke's hand and examined it with his customary thoroughness. The wax was perhaps the size of a shilling, irregular in shape, bearing a clear, if partial, impression of the signet ring's distinctive heraldic device. "Where precisely did you discover this?" Holmes inquired. "Among the ashes, as I said. I was preparing to light a fire this afternoon. The room grows cold despite the season, and when I cleared the grate, this fell out with the debris. The fireplace has not been used recently, not for several days. We have had no need of it until now." Holmes knelt before the hearth and sifted carefully through the remaining ash. His examination was minute, each particle of residue receiving attention that would have seemed excessive to anyone unfamiliar with his methods. At length he withdrew a second, smaller fragment and held it to the light. "This ash is not entirely from coal," he murmured. "There are traces of paper here as well. And this second piece of wax appears to have been subjected to multiple heatings. Observe the layering, the slight variations in colour density." "Then someone was indeed practising with the seal," Pembroke said, his voice hollow. "Testing methods to lift and replace it convincingly." "So it would appear." Holmes rose, brushing ash from his hands. "Tell me, Mr. Pembroke, who has had access to this room since you sealed the file 7 years ago?" "Myself, of course. Wickham enters daily to organise correspondence. Graves for cleaning purposes, though always under supervision. Beyond that, no one regularly, though any guest might have entered during social occasions over the years." "And your signet ring? Do you wear it constantly?" Pembroke glanced down at his hand, where the heavy gold ring rested upon his third finger. "Always. It was my father's and his father's before him. I remove it only to bathe." "I see." Holmes had moved to the window and stood gazing out at the unrelenting whiteness. "Mr. Pembroke, I must ask you to assemble the household in the drawing-room within the hour. I believe we are approaching a resolution to this matter." Our host's expression betrayed both relief and apprehension. "You know who is responsible?" "I have a theory. Whether it will be confirmed remains to be seen." After Pembroke departed to arrange the gathering, I turned to Holmes with considerable curiosity. "You suspect someone specific?" "I suspect several individuals of various degrees of involvement, but this fragment—" He held the wax to the light once more, his expression troubled. "This fragment is both too convenient and too careless. It suggests either remarkable stupidity or remarkable cunning. I am not yet certain which." The household assembled as requested, each individual displaying varying degrees of curiosity and concern. Sir Montague assumed his customary position near the fire, his judicial bearing firmly in place. Mrs. Verner occupied a settee with her needlework, though I noted her hands remained still. Wickham stood near the door in his habitual self-effacing manner, while young Finchley paced nervously near the windows. Holmes had positioned himself centrally, his back to the fire, and regarded the assembled company with an expression I could not quite read. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you are no doubt aware that Mr. Pembroke has engaged my services regarding a matter of document security. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending this gathering is coincidental. Each of you has been invited to Blackthorn Grange because you possess some connection, however tangential, to a sealed legal file that has become the subject of concern." Sir Montague stirred. "Mr. Holmes, I must protest this theatrical approach. Please, Sir Montague, allow me to continue. This afternoon, Mr. Pembroke discovered a fragment of sealing wax bearing his signet's impression hidden among the ashes of his study fireplace. This discovery suggests that someone has been experimenting with methods to lift and replace wax seals without detection. The silence that followed was profound. I observed each face in turn, Sir Montague's carefully controlled anger, Mrs. Verner's pale composure, Wickham's studied blankness. But it was young Finchley whose reaction proved most striking. The colour drained from his features, and he swayed slightly, gripping the window frame for support. "Mr. Finchley," Holmes said gently, "you appear distressed. Is there something you wish to share with us?" The young man's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I cannot bear this any longer. Edward, be silent." Sir Montague's command was sharp, but Finchley shook his head, his face a mask of misery. "No, no, I will not continue this deception. Mr. Holmes is correct. I am responsible." Mrs. Verner's needlework fell forgotten to her lap. Pembroke, who had been standing near the door, took a step forward. "Edward, what are you saying?" The solicitor's confession emerged in a rush, as though he feared losing courage if he paused. "I gained access to your study 3 nights past, Mr. Pembroke. I possessed a duplicate key, obtained through means I'm ashamed to admit, and I opened the dispatch box using lock-picking techniques I learned during a misspent youth. I examined the file and attempted to reseal it, but I botched the work. The fragments you discovered are evidence of my clumsy attempts to practice with your sealing wax, which I found in your desk drawer." Holmes had moved closer to the young man, his expression intent. "Why did you wish to examine the file, Mr. Finchley?" "I was being blackmailed. Someone knew of my past indiscretions, errors I made in my first position regarding client account management. Nothing criminal, I assure you, merely inadvisable. I was told that examining Mr. Pembroke's sealed file and reporting its contents would secure my tormentor's silence." "And did you report these contents?" Finchley's head dropped. "I did. I am deeply ashamed, but I saw no alternative. My career, my reputation, everything I have worked for would have been destroyed." "To whom did you report?" "I do not know. My instructions came through anonymous letters, with arrangements for leaving written summaries in a specified location in the village. I never saw my blackmailer." Pembroke had sunk into a chair, his face ashen. "Edward, I trusted you, brought you into my firm, mentored you." "I know, sir. I'm profoundly sorry. If you wish me to leave immediately, despite the snow—" "No one is leaving," Holmes interrupted. His tone was mild, almost gentle, yet it commanded attention. "Mr. Finchley, your confession is most interesting. Tell me, when you opened the dispatch box, did you find it difficult?" The young man blinked, confused by the question. "The lock was somewhat stiff, but I have some facility with such mechanisms. And the seals on the file itself. Describe the process by which you lifted them." I warmed them carefully with a candle flame, using a thin blade to ease them upward once the wax softened. It took considerable time and several attempts." "Several attempts? Yes, that would account for the fragments. And when you resealed the file, you used wax from Mr. Pembroke's desk." "I did." Holmes nodded slowly, then turned to address the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Finchley has provided us with a most detailed and plausible confession. The physical evidence supports his account. The motive is clear. One might consider this matter resolved." Sir Montague rose to his feet. "Then I suggest we conclude this distressing business. The young man has admitted his guilt. Let Mr. Pembroke determine what action to take." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, "though I confess myself puzzled by certain details, but perhaps they are of no consequence. Mr. Pembroke, with your permission, I should like to examine the study once more before we formalise any conclusions." Our host nodded mutely, still too shocked to speak coherently. As the gathering dispersed, I followed Holmes from the room. In the hallway, safely beyond earshot, I voiced the question that had been troubling me throughout Finchley's confession. "You do not believe him?" It was not a question. Holmes glanced at me with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Oh, I believe he believes himself guilty, Watson, which is not at all the same thing as actually being guilty. Come, we have work yet to do, and I suspect our time grows short." "Short? Why should time be a factor now that we have a confession?" "Because, my dear fellow, a false confession creates its own urgency. Someone wishes this matter concluded swiftly, and that someone has just achieved precisely what they desired. The question now becomes, can we uncover the truth before it becomes permanently buried beneath a convenient lie?" He strode toward Pembroke's study with renewed purpose, leaving me to follow in his wake and wonder what revelation yet awaited us. Chapter 8. Holmes Waits. The study appeared unchanged since our previous examination, yet Holmes approached it now with an air of heightened purpose. He moved immediately to the desk, retrieving the dispatch box and subjecting it once again to minute inspection. "Watson, observe the lock mechanism. What strikes you as noteworthy?" I examined the heavy iron fitting as best I could. "It appears well made, though perhaps somewhat stiff from disuse." "Precisely, stiff. Yet young Finchley claimed he opened it with relative ease using lockpicking techniques. Now, I have some small experience with locks of this particular manufacture, and I can assure you they do not yield readily to amateur manipulation, particularly when they have not been regularly maintained." He produced his own set of picks and after several minutes of concentrated effort, managed to release the mechanism. "You see? Even with proper tools and considerable practice, it requires patience and skill. Could a young solicitor with a misspent youth truly accomplish this in darkness, working quickly to avoid detection? Perhaps he exaggerated the ease with which he succeeded. Perhaps. Or perhaps he never attempted it at all." Holmes closed the box and turned his attention to the fireplace, kneeling once more to examine the ash. "And consider the wax fragments. Finchley claimed he made several attempts to practice the seal. Yet I find only 2 significant pieces, both showing characteristics that do not align with his described method." "What characteristics?" "The colour, for one. Pembroke's sealing wax is a deep carmine red, distinctive and consistent. These fragments show slight variations in hue, suggesting they were created using different batches of wax or under different heating conditions than one would expect from a single evening's work." He rose and moved to the window, his gaze distant. For several moments he remained silent, and I recognized the signs of intense cerebration. "Holmes," I ventured, "if you believe Finchley innocent, why did you not challenge his confession before the assembled company?" He turned to face me, and his expression was grave. "Because, Watson, a premature revelation would serve only to alert the true culprit that I have penetrated their stratagem. Far better to allow them to believe their misdirection has succeeded. A confident enemy is a careless enemy. Then you know who is truly responsible?" "I have a theory, yes, but theory without proof is merely speculation. Yeah, and I require one more piece of evidence before I can act with certainty. Tonight, I believe, will provide that final confirmation." "What do you intend to do?" "Watch, wait, and pray that our quarry makes the move I anticipate." The remainder of the day passed with agonizing slowness. Holmes adopted an air of satisfied conclusion, going so far as to compliment Pembroke on the resolution of the matter, and suggesting that Finchley's punishment should be tempered by consideration of the blackmail he had endured. Our host, still visibly shaken, agreed to consider leniency, though he could not disguise his disappointment in his protégé. Young Finchley himself had withdrawn to his chamber, pleading indisposition. Mrs. Verner expressed sympathy for his predicament while maintaining that betrayal of trust, however motivated, could not be entirely forgiven. Sir Montague pronounced a measured judgment that acknowledged both the crime and the extenuating circumstances. Only Wickham seemed to have no opinion on the matter, accepting the resolution with the same quiet deference he displayed toward all household affairs. Dinner was a subdued occasion. Holmes maintained pleasant conversation, discussing topics far removed from the day's drama, recent developments in criminal anthropology, advances in forensic chemistry, the publication of a new monograph on tobacco ash. To the casual observer he appeared entirely at ease, his mind far from the matter at hand. I knew better. I had observed this performance before, this calculated display of unconcern designed to lull suspects into complacency. Beneath the affable exterior, Holmes's mind worked with relentless precision. As the company dispersed following the meal, Holmes made a request that seemed trivial, yet struck me as significant. "Mr. Pembroke," he said casually, "I noticed earlier that the household employs both candles and oil lamps for illumination. Might I inquire as to your preference and the arrangements for their maintenance?" Pembroke appeared somewhat bemused by the question. "We use oil lamps in the principal rooms and candles in the bedchambers and passages. Wickham manages the lamp maintenance, trimming wicks, refilling reservoirs, and so forth. Graves attends to the candles." "And the oil you employ?" "A refined petroleum product from a London supplier. Wickham places the orders." "I see. Thank you. That satisfies my curiosity." Later, as we prepared for bed, I pressed Holmes for an explanation of this peculiar inquiry. "The oil, Watson. Recall the stains I discovered upon the study floor. I mentioned they suggested lamp oil rather than candle wax. If Wickham maintains all the lamps in the household, he would have ready access to both oil and the means of its application." "Then you suspect Wickham?" "I suspect everyone and no one until I possess definitive proof. But yes, the clerk interests me considerably. His position grants him access to every corner of the house, knowledge of Pembroke's routines, and intimate familiarity with the sealed file's existence and importance. Moreover, he has had 15 years to study his employer's habits and vulnerabilities. Yet what motive could he possess? He appears entirely loyal." Holmes settled into the chair by our window, positioning himself so that he commanded a view of the corridor without being visible from without. Loyalty and self-interest are not mutually exclusive, nor are they always aligned as we might expect. A man may serve faithfully for years whilst harbouring private grievances or fears. The question is not whether Wickham possesses motive, but whether that motive proves sufficient to drive him to action. "And you intend to watch all night?" "I do. I have a suspicion that our friend may attempt to complete what Finchley's confession has conveniently interrupted. If I am correct, he will wish to ensure certain evidence is permanently destroyed now that attention has been deflected elsewhere." I offered to share the vigil, but Holmes declined. "You have the gift of honest expression, Watson. Your face reveals your thoughts more readily than you realise. Should anyone encounter you watching in the corridor, they would immediately suspect surveillance. I, however, can dissemble when necessary." Thus persuaded, I retired to bed, though sleep eluded me for some considerable time. The wind had risen again, and its mournful voice filled the darkness with a sound like distant lamentation. I found myself reviewing the events of the past days, attempting to piece together the puzzle as Holmes had done. The sealed file, seemingly inviolate yet compromised, the multiple suspects, each with plausible motive, the convenient confession that resolved matters too neatly. And throughout it all, Holmes's quiet certainty that truth lay hidden beneath layers of misdirection and calculated deceit. I must have dozed eventually, for I was awakened by a hand upon my shoulder. Holmes stood beside my bed, a candle in his hand, his eyes bright with triumph. "Come, Watson. Quickly and quietly. Our patience has been rewarded." I dressed with haste and followed him into the corridor. We descended the stairs in stockinged feet, Holmes moving with the practised silence of one accustomed to nocturnal investigations. As we approached the ground floor, I perceived a faint glow emanating from beneath the study door. Holmes placed his finger to his lips, then slowly pushed the door open. The scene revealed was one I shall long remember. The room was illuminated by a single oil lamp burning upon the desk. Before the fireplace, kneeling upon the hearth, was Wickham. He had built a small fire, and as we watched, he withdrew a bundle of papers from within his coat and fed them carefully into the flames. "Good evening, Mr. Wickham," Holmes said pleasantly. "I trust we are not interrupting anything of importance." The clerk spun about, his face registering shock that swiftly transformed into resignation. For a moment he remained frozen, the papers still clutched in his hand. Then, with a gesture of profound weariness, he allowed them to fall into the fire where they curled and blackened. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, "I confess I had hoped you would prove less perceptive than your reputation suggested. It appears I was mistaken." Holmes moved to the hearth and, using the poker, retrieved what remained of the papers before they were entirely consumed. He examined the fragments briefly, then looked up at Wickham with an expression that mingled understanding with regret. "Would you care to explain?" he said gently, "or shall I reconstruct events for you?" Wickham lowered himself into a chair, suddenly appearing far older than his years. "Please, Mr. Holmes, I believe I should prefer to hear how thoroughly you have penetrated my deception. Professional pride, you understand, even in defeat." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then let us adjourn to more comfortable surroundings. Watson, would you be so good as to wake Mr. Pembroke? I believe this matter requires his presence." As I departed to rouse our host, I heard Holmes beginning his explanation in that measured, precise tone he employed when unravelling the threads of human duplicity. The game, at last, was truly over. Chapter 9. The Reconstruction of Truth. Within the quarter hour we had assembled once more in the drawing-room. Pembroke sat pale and silent, still clad in his dressing-gown, his comprehension of events clearly incomplete. I had roused Sir Montague as well, judging that his judicial presence might prove necessary. The judge arrived with admirable composure for one summoned from sleep, though his expression betrayed considerable displeasure at the irregular proceedings. Mrs. Verner appeared shortly thereafter, having apparently heard the commotion and dressed with remarkable speed. Young Finchley remained ignorant of these developments, still confined to his chamber in a state of self-imposed penitence. Wickham sat apart from the others, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his demeanour that of a man who has accepted an inevitable outcome. Holmes stood before the fire, the recovered fragments of burned documents resting upon the mantelpiece behind him. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Verner," Holmes began, "I must apologise for the unusual hour, but circumstances demand immediate clarification. This afternoon, Mr. Edward Finchley confessed to accessing Mr. Pembroke's sealed file and reporting its contents to an unknown blackmailer. His confession was detailed, plausible, and supported by physical evidence. It was also entirely false." Pembroke started forward in his chair. False? But he admitted to crimes he did not commit, though he believed himself guilty. A remarkable psychological manipulation, as we shall see. Holmes paused, his gaze settling upon Wickham. "The true architect of this affair sits before us now. Mr. Thomas Wickham, who has served you faithfully for 15 years, is the individual who accessed your sealed file, altered its contents, and orchestrated an elaborate deception to conceal his actions." Sir Montague's voice was sharp. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes. I trust you have evidence to support it." "Indeed I do. Let me reconstruct the sequence of events as they actually occurred." Holmes moved to stand behind Wickham's chair, though his attention remained fixed upon the assembled company. 7 years ago, Mr. Pembroke conducted an investigation into financial fraud involving a prominent figure. That investigation was abruptly terminated due to political pressure, and the testimony gathered was sealed and locked away. Only Mr. Pembroke and his clerk knew of the file's existence and location. I assisted with the investigation, Wickham acknowledged quietly. It was my duty. Quite so. You transcribed interviews, organised documents, and performed all manner of clerical functions essential to the inquiry. In the course of that work, you learned certain facts about the fraud, and those involved in it. Facts that, until recently, posed no particular threat to you. Holmes withdrew the paper sample he had collected from the study and held it to the light. 3 weeks ago, something changed. Perhaps you learned that the matter was being reconsidered. Perhaps you received information suggesting that renewed attention might fall upon the original investigation. Whatever the catalyst, you realized that the sealed file contained testimony that could prove devastating to you personally. I have committed no fraud, Wickham said, his voice steady but strained. Not fraud, no, but complicity. Willful blindness, perhaps, or simple failure to report what you had observed. 7 years ago, you were younger, less certain of your professional obligations. You saw evidence of criminality but chose to remain silent, either from fear or from misguided loyalty to someone implicated in the scheme. Mrs. Verner had gone very pale. Thomas, is this true? Wickham did not respond, and Holmes continued. The testimony in that file would reveal not merely the identity of the primary malefactor, but also the names of those who assisted or failed to prevent the fraud. Your name, Mr. Wickham, appears in that testimony in a context that would end your career and quite possibly result in criminal charges. But how could he access the file? Pembroke demanded. The dispatch box was locked, the study secured. The study was indeed secured. But you gave Mr. Wickham a key years ago to facilitate his daily duties. As for the dispatch box, Mr. Wickham never opened it in the conventional sense. He could not, for the lock would have shown evidence of tampering that even young Finchley's confession could not explain away. Holmes moved to the desk and gestured for someone to bring the dispatch box from the study. I retrieved it, and he held it up for examination. Observe the construction. Heavy iron, lined with steel, secured by a German lock of exceptional quality. Seemingly impenetrable. Yet note this feature, the slight gap between lid and body when locked. This gap, while insufficient for inserting one's fingers or extracting documents, is quite adequate for a different purpose. He produced a thin metal rod from his pocket. Mr. Wickham employed a variation of the old sealed letter trick. Using heated implements, specifically a slender metal rod warmed with lamp oil, he could insert this through the gap and, with considerable patience and skill, apply localized heat to the wax seals from within the box. Impossible, Sir Montague protested. The heat would be insufficient at such a distance. On the contrary, the process required hours of painstaking work conducted over several nights when the household slept. Mr. Wickham would enter the study with his lamp, explaining his presence if discovered by citing work on correspondence, and patiently warm the seals until they became malleable enough to lift with specially crafted tools inserted through the same narrow gap. Holmes drew from his pocket several thin, elongated instruments. I discovered these hidden within the lamp maintenance supplies in Mr. Wickham's workspace. Observe how they are shaped, narrow enough to fit through the box's gap, yet sturdy enough to manipulate softened wax. Wickham closed his eyes briefly but said nothing. Once the seals were lifted, Holmes continued, Mr. Wickham faced a more daunting challenge. He could not extract the documents through the gap, so he employed a different method. Using a combination of light and carefully angled mirrors, which accounts for the oil spills I noted on the floor, he was able to read portions of the testimony through the gap. His objective was not to steal the documents, but to determine whether his name appeared in a compromising context, and if so, to what extent. And did it? Pembroke asked, his voice hollow. It did, sufficiently to alarm Mr. Wickham into taking further action. He could not remove or destroy the testimony without arousing immediate suspicion. Instead, he conceived a more subtle plan. Using the same technique by which he had read the documents, he carefully altered specific passages, changing dates, modifying names, obscuring the most damaging references to his own involvement. How could he possibly accomplish such precise work through a narrow gap? With extraordinary patience and a specialized pen of his own devising, I found traces of fresh ink on one of his metal rods, ink that matches certain notations in the file. The alterations were minute, a number changed here, a name partially obscured there, but sufficient to render the testimony less immediately damaging. Holmes returned to the mantelpiece and retrieved the burned fragments. Having completed his alterations, Mr. Wickham resealed the file using wax he had carefully prepared to match Mr. Pembroke's original seal. But he knew that eventually his tampering might be discovered. He therefore devised an insurance scheme. He would create evidence pointing toward another culprit. Finchley, I breathed. Precisely. Mr. Wickham had learned through his management of the firm's affairs that young Finchley had indeed made errors in his previous position, minor infractions, long since corrected but potentially embarrassing. He used this knowledge to craft anonymous letters suggesting blackmail, planted the wax fragments in the fireplace where they would be discovered, and then waited for events to unfold. But Finchley confessed, Sir Montague objected. Why would an innocent man admit guilt? Because Mr. Wickham manipulated him into believing he had committed the crime while in some altered state of consciousness. Note that Finchley's confession included remarkably specific details about the lock mechanism and sealing process, details that only someone who had actually studied the problem would know, details I suspect that Mr. Wickham carefully revealed to him during seemingly casual conversations, allowing Finchley to construct a false memory of guilt. Holmes turned to face Wickham directly. You underestimated two factors, however. First, you assumed the wax fragments you planted would be accepted as evidence without rigorous analysis. In fact, they showed characteristics inconsistent with fresh seal lifting, variations in colour and texture that suggested they were created separately as props, rather than produced during an actual attempt. And the second factor? Wickham asked, his voice barely audible. You could not resist ensuring your alterations remained undetected. Tonight, believing Finchley's confession had deflected all suspicion, you attempted to destroy your notes, the careful records you kept while planning and executing your scheme. Those papers which I rescued from the flames contain precise descriptions of the dispatch box's dimensions, experimental notes on wax softening temperatures, and sketches of the specialized tools you created. Holmes laid the charred fragments upon the table before Wickham. These documents, Mr. Wickham, ye are your confession written in your own hand. They demonstrate premeditation, technical sophistication, and guilty knowledge that young Finchley could not possibly possess. The silence that followed was absolute. Wickham sat motionless, his face a mask of profound weariness. At length he spoke. You're correct in every particular, Mr. Holmes. I was a coward 7 years ago, and I have compounded that cowardice with deceit. I knew of the fraud. I saw evidence that should have been reported. But I was afraid of powerful men, afraid of losing my position, afraid of the consequences of honesty. He looked at Pembroke, his expression haunted. When I learned that renewed interest might fall upon that old investigation, I panicked. I convinced myself that my alterations were justified, that I was protecting myself from unjust persecution, but I knew, even as I worked, that I was crossing a line from which there could be no return. Pembroke's voice was thick with emotion. Thomas, you might have come to me. We might have found another way. Perhaps, but fear is not a rational counsellor, sir, and so I chose the path of deception, and now I must accept its consequences. Holmes regarded the clerk with an expression I recognised, not triumph, but a certain melancholy understanding of human weakness. Mr. Wickham, he said quietly, you will, I think, wish to make a full and honest statement. Sir Montague, as a member of the judiciary, might I impose upon you to witness such a statement? The judge nodded gravely. I will do so. though I confess this entire affair has left me profoundly disturbed. As Wickham was led away to compose his confession, I found myself reflecting upon the elaborate scheme that had nearly succeeded through the exploitation of one man's guilt and another's vulnerability. Holmes had solved the impossible crime by recognizing that its impossibility was itself the solution. Chapter 10. The Thaw and the Lesson. Morning brought the first signs of change in the weather. The wind had shifted during the night, carrying with it air of a marginally warmer temperature, and by the time I descended to breakfast, I could hear the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves. The siege of Blackthorn Grange was drawing to its natural conclusion. The household gathered in fragments, the previous night's revelations having shattered whatever fragile unity had existed among us. Young Finchley appeared shortly after dawn, summoned by Pembroke and informed of his innocence. The relief that flooded the young man's features was profound, though it warred visibly with shame at having so readily accepted guilt that was not his own. "I cannot understand it," he said to me as we stood together near the window, watching the slow transformation of the landscape. "How could I have convinced myself so thoroughly of something that never occurred?" "The mind is a peculiar instrument," I replied, drawing upon such psychological understanding as my medical training had provided. When presented with evidence that appears to confirm our fears, we are remarkably adept at constructing narratives that support that evidence, however false the foundation may be. Mr. Holmes suggested that Wickham deliberately fed me details during our conversations, casual remarks about locks and seals that I absorbed without conscious awareness. When the wax fragments were discovered and suspicion seemed to fall upon me, my mind assembled these fragments into a false memory of guilt. A sophisticated manipulation, I agreed, and one that very nearly succeeded. Holmes himself had risen early and closeted himself with Sir Montague and Pembroke, assisting in the formal documentation of Wickham's confession. The clerk had spent the latter portion of the night composing a detailed account of his actions, and I understood from Holmes that the statement was both comprehensive and unflinchingly honest. Mrs. Verner kept to her chambers, pleading indisposition. I suspected her absence stemmed less from illness than from distress at Wickham's exposure. Whatever the precise nature of their relationship, and I had observed sufficient evidence to suspect it extended beyond the purely professional, she had clearly placed considerable trust in a man who had proven himself unworthy of it. By mid-morning, the sound of runners upon snow announced the arrival of a sleigh from the village. The thaw had progressed sufficiently to render the road passable, if not entirely safe, and Pembroke had dispatched a message to the local constabulary requesting their attendance. The constable who arrived was a solid, sensible man named Bradshaw, who listened to Sir Montague's summary of events with the careful attention of one who knows he is confronting matters beyond his usual jurisdiction, while he treated Wickham with the courtesy due to a man not yet formally charged. Yet there was no question of the clerk's immediate departure from Blackthorn Grange in official custody. I witnessed their departure from the entrance hall. Wickham, dressed for travel and carrying a small valise, paused as he passed Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, "I wonder if I might ask you a question." "Certainly, Mr. Wickham." "At what point did you determine my guilt? Was it the oil stains, the ash fragments, or some other detail I failed to adequately conceal?" Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "It was none of those individually, though each contributed to the whole. What truly betrayed you was the excessive cleverness of your scheme. A simple theft or destruction of documents would have been crude but effective. Instead, you constructed an elaborate mechanism that required specialized tools, precise timing, and extraordinary patience. Such sophistication suggested someone with both technical aptitude and intimate knowledge of the household, qualities that described you far better than they described any of the other suspects. I see, and Finchley's confession was too convenient, too detailed, and too perfectly aligned with the planted evidence. Innocent men who confess typically do so in vague terms, overcome by general guilt or pressure. Guilty men who confess tend to minimize their actions or offer justifications. Your manipulation of young Finchley produced a confession that was neither. It was a performance of guilt rather than its authentic expression." Wickham nodded slowly. "You are as formidable as your reputation suggests, Mr. Holmes. I regret that we met as adversaries rather than allies." "As do I, Mr. Wickham. You possessed qualities that might have been employed to admirable purpose. It is unfortunate that fear led you down a different path." After Wickham's departure, the household began the process of dissolution. Sir Montague announced his intention to return to London on the morrow, his holiday having been rather thoroughly spoiled by the affair. Finchley, restored to Pembroke's good graces though chastened by his experience, volunteered to remain and assist with any legal formalities arising from Wickham's prosecution. Mrs. Verner emerged from her seclusion long enough to inform her brother that she would be seeking alternative accommodation. Whatever her relationship with Wickham had been, its exposure had clearly made her continued residence at Blackthorn Grange untenable. Pembroke accepted this decision with visible sadness, but did not attempt to dissuade her. Holmes and I found ourselves once more in the study, where the dispatch box sat upon the desk, its secrets finally laid bare. Pembroke had opened it and examined the altered documents, his expression grave as he noted the subtle changes Wickham had introduced. "The modifications are indeed minimal," he observed. "A date altered here, a name partially obscured there. Yet they would have been sufficient to cast doubt upon the testimony's accuracy and quite possibly prevent prosecution of the original malefactor." "And your own position?" Holmes inquired. "Will you now proceed with a matter that was abandoned 7 years past?" Pembroke was silent for a long moment, staring down at the papers that had caused such upheaval. "The gentleman in question has since died," he said at length. "His estate is being administered by executors who bear no responsibility for his frauds. The victims have long since written off their losses. What purpose would be served by resurrecting old scandals now?" "Justice," Holmes suggested quietly. "Truth. The principle that wrongdoing should not escape consequence merely through the passage of time. High principles indeed, Mr. Holmes. But I'm no longer the young idealist who gathered this testimony. I have seen too much of how justice is actually administered, how the powerful protect their own, how political considerations trump legal ones, how the pursuit of perfect righteousness often produces only imperfect misery." He closed the dispatch box with a decisive motion. "I shall file a report with the appropriate authorities, documenting what occurred and why. I shall ensure that Wickham faces appropriate consequences for his actions. But as for the original fraud—" he shook his head. "Some battles, Mr. Holmes, are simply not worth fighting, particularly when the victory would be entirely Pyrrhic." Holmes said nothing, but I saw in his expression a recognition of truths he had encountered many times in his career, that legal justice and true justice are not always synonymous, that the resolution of a mystery does not necessarily resolve the moral complexities it reveals. We departed Blackthorn Grange the following afternoon, travelling by hired carriage through lanes still bordered by diminishing snowbanks. The sun had emerged brilliant and cold, transforming the landscape into a dazzling expanse that hurt the eyes to contemplate. As we settled into our seats on the London-bound train, I ventured to ask Holmes his final thoughts on the affair. "It was a case that illustrated certain fundamental principles," he replied, gazing out at the passing countryside. "First, that the appearance of impossibility often masks not supernatural agency, but merely uncommon ingenuity. Second, that human psychology can be exploited as effectively as physical locks and seals. And third, that the most elaborate deceptions often fail not through any flaw in their design, but through the perpetrator's inability to resist one final, unnecessary action. Wickham's burning of his notes. Precisely. Had he simply waited, allowed Finchley's confession to stand and returned to his normal routines, I would have had suspicions but no proof. His need to eliminate all traces of his planning, a need born of anxiety rather than logic, provided the final evidence required for definitive identification. He fell silent, and I reflected upon the various individuals we had encountered at Blackthorn Grange. Sir Montague with his judicial wisdom and hidden connections to the case, Mrs. Verner with her contained bitterness and complicated loyalties, young Finchley, whose susceptibility to manipulation had very nearly destroyed him, and Wickham himself, whose accumulated compromises and surrenders to fear had led him finally to active criminality. Well, it seems a rather melancholy affair, I observed. No clear villains, no triumphant vindication of innocence. Merely a collection of flawed individuals making progressively worse decisions. Holmes smiled faintly. Welcome, Watson, to the reality of most criminal investigations. The sensational cases, the scarlet studies and silver blazes, are remarkable precisely because they are exceptional. The majority of crime is rather more prosaic, born of human weakness rather than diabolic cunning. And yet you solved it brilliantly. I observed carefully, reasoned logically, and waited patiently for the guilty party to reveal himself. Hardly brilliant, merely methodical. As the train carried us back toward London and the familiar comforts of Baker Street, I found myself considering the lesson Holmes had articulated. That deception thrives not in complexity, but in the quiet assumptions we fail to question. That security, like the sealed file at Blackthorn Grange, is only as strong as the vigilance that guards it. And that the truth, however long delayed, however inconvenient, possesses a persistent quality that eventually defeats even the most elaborate schemes constructed to conceal it. I would record this case in my chronicles as the adventure of the sealed barrister's file, and it would serve as yet another testament to Sherlock Holmes's unique genius for penetrating the veils of misdirection that men employ to hide their deeds. But it would also stand as a reminder that genius alone is insufficient. What the case truly required was something more fundamental: the patience to observe, the courage to question, and the wisdom to recognize that the impossible, properly understood, is merely the improbable waiting to be explained.